The evening air hung heavy with the weight of an approaching storm. The neon sign of the gas station flickered faintly, struggling against the dimness that had begun to settle over the town. It was the kind of night where the hum of crickets mixed with the distant growl of thunder, and every street lamp seemed to cast longer, darker shadows than usual. At pump number 3, a black luxury sedan rolled in smoothly. The car was spotless, its polished surface reflecting the cold blue lights overhead. The man behind the wheel was calm, deliberate in his movements, and carried himself with a kind of quiet authority. He was dressed not in a suit tonight, but in something casual: slacks, a button-down shirt, and a light jacket. His face was composed, though his eyes carried a deep, piercing sharpness that anyone observant enough might notice. He stepped out of the car and reached for the pump handle, inserting his credit card and beginning to fuel up. From afar, it looked like any ordinary scene. But for this man, it was anything but ordinary. He was a judge, a federal judge, no less. The kind of man whose words in court could change lives, shape futures, and determine whether justice had truly been served. His name carried weight in the legal community, though tonight, he was just another customer stopping for gas after a long day. A pair of police cruisers idled in the corner of the lot. Their engines rumbled quietly, headlights illuminating the edge of the station. Inside, 2 officers watched the scene unfold with narrowed eyes. The man at pump number 3 had caught their attention, not because he had done anything suspicious, but because of who he was. Or rather, who they thought he was. "See that guy?" one officer muttered, sipping his coffee. "Yeah, doesn't look like he belongs around here," the other replied, his tone sharp with prejudice. The words hung thick in the air. They didn't see a judge, a man who had spent years dedicated to upholding the law. They saw only his skin color. And in their narrow, biased minds, that was enough to label him suspicious. The judge, completely unaware of the scrutiny he was under, continued fueling his car, his posture calm, his demeanor quiet. He wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't looking for trouble. But trouble was looking for him. The officers stepped out of their cruiser, walking toward him with deliberate, heavy steps. Their boots struck the pavement with a rhythm that echoed through the near-empty lot. The man at the pump glanced briefly in their direction, not out of fear, but simply out of awareness. He had seen that look before, the calculated gaze of men who believed they had authority to intimidate. "Even in," one officer said flatly, his hand resting casually near his holstered weapon. "What brings you around here?" The judge's eyes lingered on him for a moment. He spoke evenly, his tone calm but carrying an undeniable weight. "Just getting gas. Same as anyone else." The second officer stepped closer, scanning the car as if it were evidence of a crime. "Pretty fancy ride. You from around here?" The judge tilted his head slightly. "Why do you ask?" That subtle shift in tone, measured, precise, was something years in the courtroom had taught him. It was the kind of response that forced people to confront their own assumptions. But these officers weren't looking for reflection. They were looking for dominance. "We're asking the questions," the first officer barked, a little louder now. His voice carried not authority, but insecurity masked by aggression. "ID. Now." For a brief moment, the air between them seemed to freeze. The judge's hand paused near the pump handle, his eyes locked on the officers. He could already feel the weight of what was unfolding. He had heard the stories. Countless times, black men stopped for no reason, harassed, profiled, treated as suspects in their own neighborhoods. He had ruled on cases where similar abuses of power had been laid bare in court. And now, he found himself living it firsthand. "I don't recall violating any law," the judge said firmly. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried with it the authority of someone who knew his rights better than most. The officers exchanged a glance, clearly unsettled by his calmness. They expected fear. They expected compliance. Instead, they found themselves facing a man whose composure only deepened their frustration. "You're refusing to identify yourself." The second officer pressed, stepping closer. His posture was confrontational, chest puffed, jaw set. "I'm saying," the judge replied steadily, "that you have not articulated a legal reason to demand my identification." "Am I being detained?" The words landed like thunderclaps. Simple, direct, legally precise. The kind of phrasing that stripped away any excuse, any fabricated reasoning. And for a moment, the officers faltered. They weren't used to this. They weren't used to someone who could dismantle their intimidation tactics with nothing more than calm, deliberate language. The first officer sneered, trying to regain control. "You're acting suspicious. That's enough reason." The judge let out a slow breath, his expression unreadable. "Suspicion is not a crime. It was a phrase he had spoken in court countless times, a principle at the very heart of constitutional law. And now, he was reminding them of it, not as a judge in robes, but as a man standing in a dimly lit gas station, facing down officers who thought their badges placed them above accountability. By now, a small crowd had begun to gather near the convenience store entrance. Customers leaving with snacks and drinks paused, sensing the tension in the air. Some pulled out their phones, recording the exchange quietly, aware of the power of evidence in moments like this. The officers noticed the cameras and grew visibly agitated. The second officer hissed under his breath, "We should take him in, teach him a lesson." The judge heard it. He heard everything. And though his face remained calm, his mind was already processing what was happening with razor-sharp clarity. This wasn't just harassment. This was misconduct, clear, blatant, undeniable. What the officers didn't know was that the man they were attempting to bully, the man they were profiling without cause, was the very judge presiding over an upcoming case involving police misconduct in their department. Their names, their records, their actions, it was all set to come under review in his courtroom within weeks. And tonight, they had handed him something more powerful than any argument, any testimony. They had given him proof. The storm overhead rumbled louder now, lightning flashing across the horizon. The judge's gaze hardened slightly as he looked at the men before him. His silence was no longer just composure, it was judgment. A judgment that would soon echo far beyond this gas station, shaking the very foundations of the office's careers. The tension lingered, thick and unrelenting, as the chapter closed with one undeniable truth: they thought they were in control. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. The rumble of thunder grew louder, rolling across the night sky like a warning. At the gas station, the tension between the officers and the man they had targeted was reaching a breaking point. The air felt charged, thick with a mixture of humidity and hostility. The neon lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a bluish glow over the pavement, while the cameras of bystanders caught every detail. The judge, still calm, leaned against his car, with the kind of composure that unnerved those who thrived on intimidation. He did not flinch. He did not stammer. He stood in quiet defiance, every word he had spoken rooted in the law itself. The first officer's hand hovered dangerously close to his holster. His jaw clenched, frustration radiating from every movement. He had come here expecting a simple show of force, a quick demand, a nervous compliance, a man slipping his ID into their hands without question. Instead, he was met with resistance. Not aggressive, not violent, but intellectual resistance. And that, more than anything, exposed his weakness. The second officer, younger and less experienced, was visibly rattled. His eyes darted nervously between the judge and the growing crowd near the store entrance. The glow of smartphone screens lit up the night as more people began recording. The officers were no longer in the shadows. Every word, every movement, every gesture, they were all being documented. "Sir," the younger officer said, his voice trembling slightly, "we're asking you again. Provide identification, or we'll have no choice but to detain you." The judge's gaze was steady, his tone deliberate. "You cannot detain me without reasonable suspicion of a crime. And fueling my vehicle is not a crime. Unless you plan to fabricate one, I suggest you step back." His words cut through the air like a blade. Calm, controlled, yet carrying the undeniable power of truth. The crowd stirred, whispers spreading among them. A woman holding her phone muttered quietly to the person beside her, "He knows the law better than they do." The first officer's patience snapped. "Listen here," he barked, his voice rising above the hum of the storm. "This is our jurisdiction. You don't tell us how to do our jobs." The judge tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Your job is to uphold the law, not violate it. There's a difference." That single sentence landed like a hammer, echoing in the ears of everyone present. The bystanders nodded, murmurs of agreement spreading like wildfire. The officers, once confident in their authority, now found themselves cornered, not by violence, but by truth. Still, pride is a dangerous thing. The first officer stepped even closer, his boots striking hard against the concrete. He towered over the judge, trying to cast a shadow that simply wasn't there. "You think you're smarter than us, huh?" he sneered. "We can make life very difficult for people who don't cooperate." For the first time, the judge allowed the faintest smile to touch his lips. It wasn't amusement. It wasn't arrogance. It was the calm, knowing smile of a man who had already seen the outcome of this encounter before it had even begun. "You've already made life difficult for yourselves," he replied evenly. The words hit harder than any shout could. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant growl of thunder and the soft click of phone cameras capturing every second. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, sweat forming at his brow. He leaned toward his partner and whispered harshly, though not quietly enough. "We need to back off. Too many eyes on us." But the senior officer was fueled by ego, blinded by the fear of losing control. He turned to the crowd, his voice booming. "Everyone step back. This is official police business." The crowd didn't move. Instead, they tightened their circle, phones raised higher. One man shouted back, "Not when you're harassing an innocent man." Another added, "We're not going anywhere." The balance of power shifted. What was meant to be a moment of intimidation had turned into a public spectacle, a trial unfolding not in a courtroom, but under the harsh glow of gas station lights. The judge straightened, his posture radiating quiet authority. He did not raise his voice, but when he spoke, every person within earshot felt the weight of his words. "You are overstepping your authority," he said, his voice low but commanding. "And you are doing it in front of witnesses. Think carefully about your next move." The storm above cracked with lightning, illuminating the tense scene for a fleeting moment. It was as if nature itself was underscoring the gravity of the moment. The officers froze. Their training, their instincts, their arrogance, all collided in a moment of hesitation. The younger officer's breathing quickened. The older officer's hands twitched, caught between pride and self-preservation. And in that stillness, the truth settled over them like a crushing weight: they were not in control. The man before them, the one they had profiled and cornered, was no ordinary citizen. He was something far greater. Someone who understood the law not just better than they did, but in ways they could never hope to twist to their favor. What they didn't realize, what they still didn't realize, was that they weren't just facing a man who knew his rights. They were facing the very judge who held their department's future in his hands. The gathering storm above mirrored the storm that was about to break in their lives. And it had only just begun. The storm in the sky seemed to mirror the storm brewing on the ground. The crackle of lightning split the clouds, and the low grumble of thunder echoed across the nearly empty streets. Inside the gas station lot, the spotlight of tension was fixed on one man, a black driver fueling his luxury car, and the two officers who thought their badges gave them unchecked authority. The crowd was larger now. What started as a few curious onlookers had grown into a dozen people, then 2 dozen. Some stood silently, phones out, recording. Others whispered heatedly to each other, their eyes darting between the officers and the man who stood so calmly, refusing to be intimidated. The judge, though no one yet knew he held such power, kept his posture steady, his voice even. He had faced angry attorneys, corrupt officials, desperate defendants, and high-stakes trials. Compared to those battles, this confrontation was almost predictable. Yet, there was something uniquely bitter about experiencing firsthand the injustice he had spent years trying to dismantle. The older officer, unable to accept the shift in power, snapped. "That's it," he barked, his voice sharp with anger. "Turn around. Hands behind your back. You're under arrest for obstruction." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The words hung in the air like poison, shocking in their audacity. Obstruction. For refusing to bow down to unlawful demands. The judge's expression remained calm, but his eyes hardened. "Obstruction of what, exactly?" he asked, his tone like a dagger. "I have complied with no unlawful order because you have given none within your authority. There is no obstruction in asserting my rights." The officer ignored him, stepping forward aggressively, cuffs in hand. His partner looked uneasy, shifting his weight nervously, glancing at the crowd with growing panic. "Sir, please," the younger one muttered, trying to reason with his senior. But the older officer was already blinded by rage. He reached out, grabbing at the judge's wrist. In that instant, the crowd erupted. "Hey, that's illegal," someone shouted. "You can't arrest him for nothing." Another yelled, "Keep recording." A woman's voice rang out. Phones angled higher, flashes of red recording lights illuminating the tension. The officers weren't just acting in front of bystanders anymore. They were acting before the world. The judge didn't resist, but his voice boomed with unmistakable authority. "Officer, if you touch me again without lawful cause, you will answer for it in court." The words stopped the officer mid-motion. Something about the way he said, "court," the way it rolled off his tongue with the certainty of experience, unsettled him. For the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. But his pride screamed louder. "Turn around," he demanded, shoving the judge's shoulder. The crowd shouted louder now. One man stepped closer, pointing his phone directly at the officer's face. "You just assaulted him. We got it all on camera." The younger officer's face turned pale. He tugged at his partner's arm, whispering urgently. Stop. Everyone's filming. This is gonna blow up. But the senior officer snarled, I don't care if CNN is filming. He disrespected us. Disrespected you. The judge cut in sharply, his voice slicing through the chaos. His calm composure gave way to something deeper, something heavier. No, officer. You disrespected the law. And you disrespected the very oath you swore to uphold. The silence that followed was chilling. Even the thunder seemed to hold off for a moment. The officer froze, his grip loosening. His partner swallowed hard, realizing the ground beneath them was crumbling. The judge straightened his jacket, looking the senior officer square in the eye. This ends now. The crowd erupted in cheers and shouts of support. Someone yelled, tell him. Another voice called out, we're with you. But the confrontation wasn't over. Not yet. The damage was already done, and the officers had already crossed lines they could never uncross. The storm above roared again, as if reminding everyone that the night had more to reveal. And though the officers didn't yet know it, their careers, their reputations, and their entire department's corruption were about to unravel at the hands of the very man they tried to silence. The night air had shifted. What began as a routine gas station stop had transformed into a powder keg ready to explode. The older officer's rash decision to push for an arrest had already backfired. His partner's nerves were frayed, and the crowd's outrage was boiling over. Sirens pierced the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Backup was on the way. Blue and red lights flickered against the horizon, bouncing off wet asphalt and shimmering across the sedan parked at Pump 3. The judge exhaled slowly, steadying himself. He had seen this tactic before. Escalation. When intimidation failed, more uniforms were brought in to drown out reason with sheer numbers. But numbers didn't make law. And he was about to remind them of that. The crowd murmured, shifting uneasily as two additional cruisers screeched into the lot, their tires spitting gravel. Doors flew open. 4 more officers emerged, hands already resting near their belts, eyes scanning the scene like predators circling prey. What's going on here? One of them demanded, striding toward the group. His tone was clipped, impatient, his chest puffed with assumed authority. The senior officer from earlier pointed sharply at the judge. This man's being uncooperative. Refused to provide ID. Possible obstruction. The new arrivals bristled, adjusting their stances, preparing for confrontation. But before they could close in, the younger officer blurted out, his voice cracking under the pressure. He hasn't done anything. He was just getting gas. The words shocked everyone, the crowd, the backup officers, even the judge himself. For a split second, silence fell, broken only by the buzz of the neon lights overhead. The senior officer's face turned crimson. What the hell are you doing? He hissed at his partner. Don't undermine me in front of everyone. But the younger officer stood his ground, trembling but resolute. It's the truth. He hasn't broken any law. The crowd cheered, voices rising in support. Tell the truth, officer. One shouted. Finally, someone with sense. Another added. The backup officers shifted uneasily. They weren't sure who to believe anymore. The scene was no longer a clear show of police dominance, it was fractured, messy, and public. And the man at the center of it all stood taller with every passing second. The judge turned slightly, addressing not just the officers, but the crowd as well. His voice carried a weight that cut through the chaos. You see what happens when authority is unchecked. He said firmly. A man fueling his car is treated as a criminal. Rights are trampled. The law is twisted into a weapon. He paused, letting the words hang in the charged air. The crowd grew silent, leaning in, captivated by his tone. Even the officers hesitated, their authority slipping further away with every sentence. This, the judge continued, his voice deepening, is why accountability matters. Because no badge, no gun, no uniform places anyone above the law. The crowd erupted in applause, shouts of agreement echoing across the lot. The storm overhead answered with another flash of lightning, illuminating the faces of officers who suddenly looked less like protectors and more like defendants awaiting judgment. The senior officer tried to regain control, barking orders at the backup. Detain him now, before this gets out of hand. But the younger officer stepped forward, holding out a trembling hand. No, we can't. You're crossing the line. Gasps rippled through the crowd. It was mutiny in real time, an officer refusing to back up misconduct, choosing conscience over blind loyalty. The senior officer's eyes blazed with fury. You're finished, he spat. You'll regret this. But the judge's eyes never left him. Calm, unwavering. His voice cut through the storm once more. No, officer. The only ones who will regret tonight are those who chose to abuse their authority. The storm cracked open above, rain beginning to fall in heavy drops, each one striking the pavement like the pounding of a gavel. Nature itself seemed to deliver the verdict. The balance of power had shifted. And though the officers didn't yet know the man's true identity, they could feel it. Deep down, they knew. Something about him was different. Something about his words carried the weight of final judgment. It was only a matter of time before the truth came crashing down on them. The first drops of rain spattered against the pavement, darkening the concrete around the pumps. Within moments, the drizzle became a steady pour, soaking the officers, the crowd, and the man at the center of it all. The storm had broken, and with it came a shift in atmosphere. The flashing police lights reflected off the wet ground, casting eerie streaks of red and blue that danced beneath the pounding rain. The judge stood still, the water sliding down his jacket, his face calm and unshaken. Around him, the crowd raised jackets, umbrellas, and phones to shield themselves from the downpour, but no one left. If anything, the storm only deepened their resolve to witness what was happening. The senior officer, drenched and furious, barked again at his colleagues. Cuff him. Now. His voice cracked with desperation, his authority slipping with every syllable. But the younger officer shook his head, rain dripping from his cap. We can't. This isn't right. The backup officers hesitated, their uncertainty visible even through the downpour. They had come expecting to support their fellow officers. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a scene unraveling faster than they could process. The judge finally spoke, his voice steady despite the storm, cutting through the roar of rain. Do you know what happens, he said slowly, when those sworn to uphold the law choose to violate it instead? The senior officer sneered, but his eyes betrayed unease. Save the lecture. You think you're some kind of lawyer. The judge's lips curved into the faintest smile, his eyes locked on the officers. Closer than you realize. The words sent a ripple through the crowd. Phones tilted closer, capturing every word, every nuance. The officers stiffened, sensing a shift they couldn't quite name. The judge stepped forward, the rain plastering his shirt to his frame, his voice rising not in anger, but in clarity. I have sat in courtrooms where men like you swore under oath that you served justice. And I have seen the truth behind those lies. Tonight, you've made the same mistake. The senior officer froze. Something in the man's tone, measured, practiced, sharp as steel, felt familiar. The way he spoke wasn't like an ordinary citizen. His words carried the cadence of authority, the kind that didn't come from a badge or a gun, but from something far greater. Who are you? The younger officer asked, his voice barely audible over the storm. The judge's eyes never wavered. He didn't answer directly, not yet. Instead, he turned to the crowd. These men thought their badges gave them the right to strip away my dignity. They thought the color of my skin made me a suspect. But what they didn't know is that the law they bend and break stands right here before them. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Whispers spread like wildfire. Is he a lawyer? No, he sounds like more than that. Wait, he's someone important. The senior officer's face drained of color. His partner swallowed hard, realization dawning slowly, terribly. The judge stepped closer, lowering his voice so that only the officers could hear, though the cameras caught every word. In 3 weeks, I will preside over a case of misconduct involving your department. Your names, your records, your choices will be under scrutiny. And tonight, he said, his tone cutting like a gavel striking wood, you've provided all the evidence I need. The senior officer staggered back a step, his mouth opening and closing with no sound. His arrogance, his bravado, gone. The younger officer's eyes widened, his chest rising and falling rapidly as the weight of the revelation crashed over him. The crowd exploded. Shouts rang out. He's a judge. Oh my God. They just profiled a judge. The truth spread like lightning, impossible to contain. The backup officers froze, their eyes darting between the drenched figure of the man they had nearly cuffed and their colleagues who now stood pale and trembling. The storm above seemed to echo the crowd's uproar, thunder shaking the ground beneath their feet. The judge's voice rose one final time, clear and unyielding. Justice will not be silenced. Not here. Not tonight. Not ever. The rain poured harder, soaking everyone to the bone. But no one cared. They had witnessed something unforgettable, the moment when arrogance met its reckoning, when the gavel of truth fell not inside a courtroom, but on the wet asphalt of a gas station. And for the officers who had tried to profile him, the real trial was only just beginning.